Hello and welcome to Fandom Friday, a podcast series devoted to various fandoms brought to you by the Ocean County Library's Fan Nation Committee. This podcast series is a part of the Fan Nation, the Greek Extravaganza, which is our annual all-ages library convention. This year is our 10th anniversary. You can join us on Saturday, October 4th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for all the fandom fun. In the meantime, my name is Hope, and joining me today is my colleagues.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm from a teen librarian from the Lakewood Library branch.
I'm Julia. I am from the Point Pleasant Borough branch, and I'm a library assistant.
And today, for this episode, we will be discussing fairy tales. So I will kick us off with the first question, and that is, what do we think separates fairy tales from regular fantasy? And I see Casey has an answer ready to go.
So I was talking with Julia about this before you hopped on, but I took a fairy tales class in college, which was super interesting. And one of the things that separates fairy tales from regular fantasy is it's something called a verbal icon, which is like, as an example, when you start a fairy tale, it'll say, once upon a time there was a princess who was pretty. Like the only character trait you get for someone is usually very simple, and usually you just get one or two. Like, instead of having like a descriptor like you might in a fantasy novel of for 10 pages in Tolkien about how a certain tree looks, it'll be like the old tree or the pretty girl, so something like that. They tend to be very basic in their descriptions of things and people, as opposed to fantasy where they get more involved. The only difference is, I'm going to get real sophisticated for a second. It is this thing called Kunstmärchen, which are they're called art fairy tales. That's the best way to translate it from German. And that those are slightly longer, and that's where you get stories like the Nutcracker, but they're still fairy tales because they still have very limited descriptors. I'm sorry, I spoke for a long time.
That was normal answer length, I would say. I had kind of a more broad answer to that because I did not have that same knowledge, but I thought that the designation was potentially origin. Like, if you boil it down to like what's a fairy tale and what's just fantasy, like I feel like fairy tales are they're like a classically renowned tale. There's something that wasn't an oral tradition. The story started in a tradition, and it has a specific model that follows that specific like character with the marker. It's passed over time, has a specific message that's either hidden or obvious that drives the plot and the main character. Where like a fantasy story, I feel like that's a genre, whereas like fairy tales can be fantastical, but a fantasy doesn't have to follow the model that a fairy tale does.
Yeah, I agree with you, Julia. I didn't have all the knowledge that Casey has, but I kind of think that it has to have an origin in some sort of folk tale that was usually, like you said, oral tradition that was passed down. And to me, like, if you have a fairy tale or a fairy tale retelling, it has to have an origin of some original tale. Like, you can always do your own spin on it, but it's its own. Although there is, to me, a lot of gray area between like mythology versus fairy tales. And I guess the heartbreak might be if you're dealing more with like gods in a pantheon, it's more of a mythology, versus if you're just talking about stories or like moral tales. Those are the more the fairy tales that we're familiar, like the Grimm brothers kind of gathered, and other ones, but that's one of the more famous.
Although I will say, sometimes the Brothers Grimm's have the devil in it. Like, there's a lot of stories that are like not technically like the Disney canon that have the devil in it for some reason. So I mean, I guess Christianity isn't its own pantheon, but like, I'm sorry, I'm being pedantic.
Well, actually,
the influence is there.
Yeah, I think that's a question we have further down on how do we define fairy tales. We want to talk about how we Disneyfied them. But before we get there,
right, for our next question, it says many fairy tales developed similarly across different regions despite distance and contact or lack thereof, or time apart from each other. Why do you think that is?
so the reason I had for that is I think a lot of fairy tales kind of get their origins in universal, like human desires and emotions. Because like one of my favorite examples of a fairy tale that seems to be consistent across cultures is Cinderella. There's a Chinese version of Cinderella where basically she has an embroidered slipper that she is wearing when she's out with the water buffalo and it gets muddy. So she hangs it up to dry, and here comes a bird that takes it away to the prince, who instantly falls in love with her based on the slipper and goes looking for her. And I think the idea of like the story of Cinderella where she was wronged, and in the end, the people who wronged her get their just desserts, and she gets happily ever after with this prince who was just out there looking for her is kind of something that I know is attractive to me. And the popularity of fairy tales, I think we like to think there's someone out there for us.
I did write that question, but if you don't mind me answering next, I was reading a research paper from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, written by Irene Doster, and she was writing a little bit about how there was a lot of evidence indicating that similar types of stories were being told simultaneously in geographically disparate continents from each other. Like while the Grimm tales and things were originating in Europe, and they were orally told through like peasants and stuff until they were started to be transcribed by writers, and then distributed more widely. They were told simultaneously in Asia, Africa, places that were, had no contact for so long, but they still started similarly, and that centuries passed before anything was transcribed by authors. So there's a lot of like, you can't really imagine the different steps in the evolutions of the tales that we're familiar with now, but also that people alter things in folklore to make it fit social or psychological needs, as well as the values that are driving society at the time, it does show a lot of the evolution of Disney stories, which I relate to a different question later on.
So, just to throw my hat in the ring, this whole concept of things being similar in different places without them having necessarily met. Well, yes, because a lot of times it happens because it's a universal human experience. Like everyone falls in love, for example, or like everyone wants those romance stories. There's these things. They're called archetypes. They're which was I think first coined by C.G. Jung. But although it's something that's been described way before he named it in fairy tales and even mythologies, different mythologies have the same kind of things happening. Like there's great floods in many different mythologies, like Christianity and the Sumerians and so on and so forth. So it the archetype is meant to be like these sort of universal things that we kind of cling to, and no one knows exactly how we have them all the same. There's some where it's like ingrained. Some people think it was ingrained in us from birth. Some people think we just learned it from culture. But that's, I guess, just the technical name. And I'm sorry if I sound like the actually kind of person right now. This is what I minored in, and I minored in mythology in college. So this is like my one of my favorite topics.
That's okay. We're all a little nerdy here.
We're used to the happily ever after as a definition of a fairy tale, but many of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen stories are cautionary moral tales. What made that change?
And Casey's ready to go.
Casey.
So I will say even back then, people were telling the writers that they were not very child-friendly stories, in that like in the Brothers Grimm Cinderella, for example, the evil stepsisters cut off parts of their feet to try to fit in the slippers, and then their eyes get pecked out in the end. And there are just like many other horrible examples of stuff like this. They do happen in other stories too. Like not all fairy tales are flowers and rainbows. A lot of the more traditional ones that started out were like had awful things happen to people. So I personally think that this happened when we started having a shift to what we consider children's media, because like now we would never read a story like the original Cinderella to like little children. We'd give them the Disney version. So I just think that this came from like a shift in perspective as to what children are consuming nowadays and what we find acceptable for them.
Yeah, if I can bounce off that, I mean, I took children's literature in college, and if you go back through the literature, a lot of the beginning children's literature were moral tales, basically. I think it's because in the past, the world was a lot more dangerous than it is now, like especially for children. Like you wander off in the woods, you can get lost and you could die. So that's why we would have Hansel and Gretel, don't go wandering off through the woods because a witch might eat you. So that's, I think, kind of why so many of the original tales are kind of what we would consider very dark and not child friendly. And I think the reason now we associate all the fairy tales with children and child friendly is because we've had 100 years of Disney, and the first animated movie, Snow White. It's just so much part of our culture now, where the last 100 years, if you're talking about a fairy tale, we're talking about a Disney movie. So, but still, if you look at the Disney movies, they are still moral tales. I mean, they tell you to follow your heart, to be a good person. So we've tuned down some of the consequences, but the villains still get their comeuppance. So I think that's why we still associate them with children.
Real fast. Well, oh, I'm so sorry.
No,
real
you're good.
fast before we I wanted to share, there was this guy from Germany who wrote these moral tales for his children. I think it was either a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. And it's called like I don't know how to translate the name, but it's called Struwwelpeter, and all of them are moral tales, and one of them is my favorite one, is like a lesson about not sucking your thumb. And the boy sucks his thumb while his mother isn't home, and this guy comes in and cuts off both his thumbs, and then he doesn't have any. So that they made a joke about that on Family Guy, which I don't know if the teens are still watching, if that's like a fun thing for teens to watch. I used to watch it when I was a teen, but they made a joke about that on Family Guy, and that was like an actual story that people told to their kids before bed. So it's, yeah, they used to be so much crazier than they are.
Yeah, I think because the consequences were so much more serious back then if you didn't listen to your parents.
Yeah, and a lot of them were dark, and like you guys said, they didn't start as stories that were meant for children exactly, and then they had to be softened to fit a child's narrative. But then there were also the lessons that you wanted to pass on, but you also wanted them to have a good imagination, and you wanted them to start fostering hope for things. You didn't want everything to seem so sad and brutal for a child. You want children raised with, like, you want them to have a flowering imagination, and you want them to have hope. You want them to be the next generation. You don't want to crush their spirit before they reach any type of, like, even like a juvenile maturity moving into like young adulthood. You don't want them to go into life like that. And there was an article I found that was like 5 reasons fairy tales are good for children on Learning Through Literature, which is a website. I couldn't find the woman's last name for some reason. It just wasn't on there at all. There was no contact information posted, but her name is Katie. And she quoted a few things, and one of them was that children don't need to be reminded of the world's harsh realities. They need to be filled with wonder at its beauty and possibilities. That confidence, teaching values and goodness, actions have consequences, kindness counts, ordinary people can overcome seemingly great challenges. They inspire and enrich imagination because the bad things are always going to happen in life. If you keep telling stories that just reflect, like, yes, reality can be so depressing, but also it can be so beautiful. And that's why imagination exists, to talk about all of the what ifs that are amazing. And that's kind of what you want to be giving children to work with while they're growing up.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe the evolution of fairy tales for children. I guess in that vein, the next question, what do we think it is that makes the storytelling of fairy tales so important, and why?
I'm an author, and just even apart from that, like I said, I was a myth minor in college, and I took these fairy tale class, and I just think that telling stories is just such an essential part of like what we are. Like it's something that we've been doing since before we had like proper words. Like the cavemen were telling stories through pictures on their cave walls of hunts and things that happen. And I feel like there's a reason that we have these stories all throughout, and we have these things, and that we it's just something that we do. But we communicate and share messages and everything through story. Even today, like your favorite movie, your favorite book has a message in it, whether it's a fairy tale or not. So I it just storytelling is just, no other animal does it. We do that. So I just feel like it's a uniquely human kind of activity.
That is true. We all appreciate a good story. I think also the fact that these fairy tales, that we're telling them, hundreds, thousands of years after whoever it was that started it, is a testament that they knew how to tell a good story. And we'll have characters, even if they are archetypes. You'll usually have like the three siblings, and the youngest sibling, is usually the one that's successful. Like, still, you can relate to them and see them overcoming and struggling, and then in the end they win, even if, like, for instance, The Little Mermaid, where as a child when I read it and she ends up like sea foam and turns into like, I don't know, some sort of little fairy creature, and I was like, so depressing. But as an adult, I reread that and it was like, oh, well, actually she didn't have a soul, but now she has the opportunity to gain a soul to be able to live on after death. So then it was like, oh, it was kind of hopeful. So that's, I think, why good storytelling is something that you just keep on thinking about it, even when you're finished listening to the story.
That's true. I do think it has the ability to resonate with you in different ways throughout your life. Like maybe there's a theme that you understand in one way as a child that you understand completely different as an adult, and it has the ability to affect you the same way and give you the same sense of whimsy while kind of touching just like a different part of your heart or tickling a different part of your brain. And I also think that storytelling is an art, and I think it should be considered an art form the same way that sculpture is an art form, the same way that like even like dance is an art form. Any people know what art is, any art form that you can think of, storytelling falls under the category of an art form, and it does take a specific talent to begin telling that story. But once you get that ball rolling, it does stick with people and it does matter. And in the same way that we need art to nurture our souls, like we do need storytelling as an art form to nurture our souls. We do need stories. We do need creativity and spirit and something that connects people culturally as well. So I think having things that people can relate to in culture and things that allow us to connect on a level where we can relate to each other, even if I have nothing in common with the person next to me, I could have that one thing in common, that we both love this one thing, or this story touches us. And I think that it continues to allow people to connect, but also like it nurtures a part of your soul. Absolutely.
That was so beautiful.
Thank you.
That sort of leads into our next question. Although what you said wasn't specifically about any sort of storytelling engine, this question is, which Disney movie based on a fairy tale is your favorite?
And this was a question that I wrote because I wanted to gush over Aladdin. Aladdin is my favorite. I love all three of the animated movies, even if Robin Williams only is the genie in the first and the third. And a lot of people don't, I think, know that there were three of them. But in the third one, the Aladdin, the Prince of Thieves, Aladdin meets his dad, who's a thief, and he's charming. And you see where Aladdin gets his charm from. But that's my favorite Disney movie, hands down. And even when they redid it as a live action and it didn't have Robin Williams because he's sadly no longer with us, I still enjoyed it. Like they expanded it a little bit and like kind of added their own twist, but it was still fun. Like I will never get tired of Aladdin.
I will follow that up quickly only because I also said Aladdin first, but I knew that you were going to say that. But I loved that it was like, it's an underdog romance story. I love Robin Williams, but my close runner-up was probably The Little Mermaid, just because I always wanted to be a mermaid. And I was also an avid H2O fan after that. And I spent a fair share of summers playing mermaids in diving fins that I thought was so cool in the pool. And I like had to bring them to, if I went to my friend's pool, I had to bring my fins so that I could be a mermaid and swim better. And I loved like singing growing up. I still love singing now. So like that her voice was such an important part of like her story and how she lost it and still had to find a way to communicate with people. But it's so hard to pick because then also how do you disregard Belle's Library? Who doesn't want Belle's Library? I loved Beauty and the Beast for the same reason, but all of them had fantastic music. So I'm sure I was the most obnoxious child ever, just like over and over again with the songs. But those are my top ones for sure.
Speaking of the songs, my grandma and I, for some reason, our song together is A Whole New World. Whenever we sing it in the car, she takes Aladdin, I take Jasmine. It's ever since I was a kid, we've been doing that. I also still play mermaids to this day. But my favorite, which you touched on, was Beauty and the Beast. I mean, I was always the reading kid, so I loved like Belle's love for books, and I loved like that she was like a fierce, like kind of advocating for herself kind of princess, sort of like Jasmine was, where like the Beast is like, oh well, we're gonna be in love now, and she's like, no, we're not. You kidnapped me. I don't like you. And then like that, obviously that develops, but like I just liked how she was like a strong person and she didn't fall for like the first prince or prince-like guy Gaston, and even the prince in general before he earns it, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one of my favorites.
And I will say, I don't know if it's like, I don't know the audience. I don't know what it's worth bringing up, but I also, moving into middle school, I was also very obsessed with John Cozart's After Ever After parody songs of the Disney movies. Not appropriate for all audiences, but fantastic. I loved them so much.
They're so funny.
Yeah, sometimes as an adult looking back at some of these, you're like, wait a minute, who let these children do these things?
Yeah, right.
Like in The Little Mermaid, for example, when she's like, I'm 16 years old, I'm not a little kid anymore. When you were a kid, you were like, yeah, that's right, she's practically an adult. But like when you're watching it now, you're like, don't talk to your father like that.
Yeah, and like I think about when I was like 16 and what, just first of all, what I looked like. Okay, I was not by any means like, I was not an adult. Should not have wanted anybody to think like I was older than I was. You know, when you're in that age range where you're starting to move in, like before college, you're like, no, I'm a grown up and I want people to treat me that way. And now I'm like, I just wish that I could have been in this like delusional stage of my life forever where I had no responsibilities and what do these kids want to do growing up so fast. But an underdog movie also, I really like, I liked the Frozen movies a lot, and I think maybe that's just because I like to cry to them sometimes, especially the second one. The second one has such an unwavering ability to really just like pull the heartstrings for me so much, and I do love the like sisters a lot in the music. But
I do like Frozen. Like, I have a sister, and she's got light blonde hair, and I have like brownish hair, and I'm like, look, we're Anna and Elsa.
Oh,
I love it. Leading into the next question, do you have a fairy tale that you wish more people knew about?
So I have one that I like. It's a Russian fairy tale, actually. It's called The Firebird and the Tsarevich Ivan. And the firebird in Russian mythology is like a very important magical creature. And in the fairy tale, it's stealing the golden apples from the Tsar, who sends his sons out to try to capture it. And you have the three sons, and the older two, they fall asleep. They're lazy. They don't work hard. But the youngest one, he follows it. He goes through these different trials until he's finally successful, and because he has a good heart, and that's why when he comes back triumphant, he's gets to be the next Tsar. And as the youngest of three siblings, I always like in the fairy tale how it's the youngest one who gets everything, because when you're the youngest of three siblings growing up, sometimes you feel like you get all the leftovers.
I have two.
I like.
The first one is much longer than the normal. It's like an actual book, but it's one of those Kunstmärchen I was talking about in the beginning, and it's called The Golden Pot. And I'm trying to. I don't even know how to explain the plot to you because it's like a fever dream, but essentially this guy like starts working for this guy who's a wizard and falls in love with his daughter who's a snake, but you don't know if any of this is real throughout the whole story. And the wizard he's working for is beefing with this lady whose sons are apples, and it's such a weird story, but I love it so much just because it's so weird. And my other favorite, which is completely on the opposite vein, is called The Juniper Tree. And that one is about once upon a time there was a little boy, and he had a little sister and his mother was mean, and for some reason she just hated him. So she killed him one day. When she smacked him across the face, his head came off. So she tied a ribbon to his neck and like left him there. And the little sister was like, I want to play with my big brother, and she touched him and his head fell off. So she told the little girl that she was like, listen, you don't want your father to find out you killed your brother, do you? So we're going to put him in the stew. So then the father ate the little brother, but he came back as a bird, and he dropped it, and he lived in this juniper tree, and he dropped like a pretty dress on his sister, and I forget what he gave the father, but he dropped a brick on his mother's head and she died, and then he was reborn as another little boy, and that was the whole fairy tale. And I just think it's so crazy too.
Why don't people talk about that one? Don't know why that didn't make it to Disney.
So it might be the cannibalism, but
wow.
If I didn't know you were a horror writer, Casey, I might have been worried.
No, that one, that's probably why I like it.
Oh my god.
The other runner-up is Bluebeard, but I think a lot of people do know about that one.
Yeah, it's kind of an offbeat, but
yeah. I feel like I didn't really have anything that I felt like was very obscure, fairy tale wise, but I do think that in terms of stuff that I just wish more people knew about, like I wish more people would try to look into it. I really love Mayan folklore and Mayan there's Mayan cautionary tales, and it's kind of like it's a Mayan version of what we're familiar with as Aesop's fables, but they were one of those separate things where like it was just based on common values and common things that you hope are passed through people morally, with just different characters, like whether it's going to be a fox or a jaguar or like a coyote or something like that. But I love these Mayan tales, and I also really love like Native American stories as well, because a lot of them on how they describe natural phenomena and how they described everything with it's like such a beautiful appreciation for life. Like everything was living, you know, like even the way that the stars were invented and the way that like I just like different things in nature. I love the way that they're described and the way that they're personified and given a soul and kind of given something, an aspect that forced people to respect and appreciate and have gratitude for these things just for existing, which I really love. And what the stories that people tell of constellations, those are probably some of my favorite because they have such beautiful stories, and they're given such a human touch to these things that otherwise can be so coldly explained by science. So I really love to read back through those every single time I come across them, or you know, crack a book open that I have on them. But finding the Mayan tales, when I was doing some digging for this podcast and I was trying to figure out how worth it was to look up fables as opposed to fairy tales and fantasies, even though they hold a similar value, they're definitely not as fantastical or long and didn't have exactly the same cultural impact that led Disney to picking up a lot of their things. But some of the things I found cool were specifically Conjabal Mayan stories, because it's a culture that still exists, and there's different pockets of Conjabal Mayan people in the United States, specifically in the Midwest. But looking through these stories was really cool, and I kind of hope that more people will continue to read them and continue to look into them, because these are the things that are fading culturally, or the ones that people don't see as much because they're not what's being pushed in mainstream media. Maybe it does require more digging, but those are the stories that I like the most.
I will say, if you or anyone else really like the constellation stories, the the Ocean County College has a planetarium there, and they have a program where I think it's like $10. You go in and they go over the constellations and they tell you stories about each one, like the stories behind them, not like no scientific, well, maybe like a few scientific facts, but like it's mostly just like, oh yeah, this is why Orion is in the sky and this is why this is there. So it's really fun.
And then to add on what you were saying about like the different Native American like the tales and the moral tales, that made me think of like the trickster, and how you also have that across cultures. Like you have like the coyote in a lot of the Native American ones. You have Anansi the spider in some different African fairy tales. You have Loki in Norse. So like I always like the kind of like the chaotic god, where he's not evil, but he's just doing his thing and causing havoc and forcing everyone else to kind of deal with that. But it's kind of interesting how like a lot of cultures do have similar tales like that.
Yeah, and a lot of them do boil down to like, I was just looking through the one I printed out, like specifically the coyote and the hen, which is like a similar, like, oh, like the fox and the crow. Like if the hen listens to the coyote or the crow listens to the fox, like they're going to get eaten. And it's like, don't take everything that people say for face value, because you never know when people are just out for themselves.
Hello, adventurers. If you enjoy this content, please take a look at the Ocean County Library's new podcast called Forge Your Imagination, a guide to immersive world building. This new podcast is dedicated to helping creative individuals design their own expertly crafted worlds for books, games, Dungeons & Dragons, and more. Tune in on the first Wednesday morning of every month to learn more. Thanks for listening, and safe travels, adventurers.
And that leads us into our next question. Who has written your favorite fairy tale?
I'm torn between E.T.A. Hoffman, who wrote The Golden Pot. He also wrote The Nutcracker, which I read every Christmas season. And also the Brothers Grimm, because their fairy tales are just so messed up and I love it.
For me, I like, since I like the Aladdin movie, I also like the Aladdin, like the original tale through the Arabian Nights. You have a lot of different translators. Like there's been some more modern translations that they've done. But in the original Aladdin, like Aladdin has a mother, and Aladdin makes her go to the Sultan to ask for the princess's hand in marriage because he sneaked a peek when she was going through the marketplace when everyone else was told you can't look at the Sultan's daughter. And an interesting thing too, in the Arabian Nights, Aladdin is actually set in China. Probably because whoever was writing it wanted it to be kind of exotic and far away. And so they're like, well, China's kind of far away, so let's set it there. But I've never seen anyone like doing an Aladdin retelling set in China, even though that's where it's set. But I did see there was a one that we actually have here at the library. They did a adaptation of different fairy tales in the 80s, and one actually directed by Tim Burton. And one is Aladdin and His Wonderful Lamp, and it has Leonard Nimoy plays the evil magician who pretends to be Aladdin's uncle and tricks him into getting the lamp. And
I can see that.
Yeah. So like most people, I've only seen Nimoy as Spock. So to see him as a like this evil, like mustache twirling, like funny villain, like I was like, whoa, that's the same actor. So that's probably my favorite fairy tale, both Disney and original.
I think I don't know if this, I mean, how much it really counts. It's also something that was picked up by Disney, I believe, because it was animated first a while ago. But I really love Alice in Wonderland, and I'm not sure how much it really falls under the same like fairy tale situation, but it's certainly a fantastical story, and it has so many retellings, and obviously the more original retellings are dark and the newer ones are a little more whimsical. But I really loved Alice in Wonderland for sure, Lewis Carroll, and Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine for sure.
I will say before I lead us into our next question, it's worth noting that like the Brothers Grimm or like Charles Perrault or like all the like fairy tale writers of old didn't necessarily write these. They wrote them down as they were hearing them. Like the Brothers Grimm went throughout. It wasn't Germany back then because Germany wasn't unified until like 1870 something. But like they went through the lands that are now Germany and like collected them, and so did Perrault, I believe. So like it's worth noting that even though I said the Grimms were my favorite, it wasn't necessarily their story, even though they added their horrible flair to it. But yeah. Okay. So our next question, which I think flows really well from what you guys were all saying, is what books and or other media are some of your favorite fairy tale retellings? And I'm going to start Shrek. Everyone loves Shrek. I watched that when I was a kid on repeat, and I love how it plays with the themes. And I don't know if you guys know this, but that came because they wanted to make this at Disney, and Disney told them no. So they started their own company, DreamWorks, and made Shrek and made fun of all the stuff that Disney was doing. So, and then Shrek is just like hugely successful and wonderful. So that's one of my favorite kind of fairy tales.
We should also, if we're going to go that way, we should also just briefly skate across Hoodwinked.
Yes, Hoodwinked.
But I only thought of that after you said Shrek, because I have a completely different answer. But I will cut in
like
and say
sausage
Hoodwinked.
man with the you know the song with like the sausage. I can't.
Yes.
Well, one of my favorite TV media is Once Upon a Time's TV series that it went from 2011 to 2018. And the premise is it takes all the fairy tales that we're familiar with here in the United States, and the characters had lived in the Enchanted Forest, but they were cursed and sent to Storybrooke, Maine, and with false memories. And so the main character, Emma, she has to go and basically break the curse, but she doesn't really believe in the curse. And the son she gave up for adoption 10 years ago convinces her to come to Storybrooke and tells her, what she's supposed to do. And slowly, like, all the backgrounds of the characters is revealed. So it went on maybe a little longer than it should have, but it also had a spin-off on Alice in Wonderland. It was interesting how you said, Julia, like, Alice in Wonderland, it's not necessarily like a fairy tale per se, but it does get folded into it like a lot whenever you do like fairy tale retellings. And also like Peter Pan, The Wizard of Oz. I think just because these are really old movies that basically everyone living today, like, they have knowledge of it. So
Yeah.
that's kind of modern fairy tales, I guess maybe we could call that. At least here in America.
But most of my suggestions, there are book series, but I will mention Descendants first, just because even if some of them had some really cheesy CGI, I did really like Descendants, because if it was like the cool, it's like every rebel kid wants to watch a movie about like the villain's kids trying to be like friends with the princesses and the prince's kids, and like having the underdog characters. And I did like that it showed that side of things, and it kind of retold the villains' stories a little bit, gave the kids some redemption, which I liked. But my most like memorable series that I read in middle school that was inspired by Alice in Wonderland is called Splintered by A.G. Howard. It's 4 books. And it was about this high school girl who was always weird. She was born with the ability that she calls a curse to hear bugs speak. And her mother was in a mental hospital due to the perceived madness, something that was said to run in her family. And she's kind of like, she thinks that she's just trying to beat the clock on that sort of ailment as well. And as she begins to move into adulthood, things start to reach a peak when she finds clues alluding to Wonderland, which the book refers to as Underland instead. And that Underland is in trouble. It's up to her to fix this problem that's happening. And in turn, her family curse, quote unquote, will be broken, and she can go home and save her mother. So she travels with her best friend to Underland to undergo a series of tests to prove her worthiness, awaken her abilities, while there's a morally gray character lurking around, kind of helping them, kind of not. But yeah, like him either way. And it's definitely, it's a little dark as well, but I liked it. And I want to say the main character is probably like 16, 17 as well. And then I like the Twisted Tale anthologies, which retell a lot of classic Disney stories in kind of a darker way with twists that deviate from the plot that are more of a Disney style what if, which I like. And then Starling House, which is a one-off. It's kind of like a gothic fantasy that's also a little bit inspired by Alice in Wonderland. And then I think last one I will bug with is The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer, which is a sci-fi series, but it does pull really heavily from fantasy. And the first book is a spin on a Cinderella character, moves on to a Red Riding Hood inspired character, and then a Rapunzel one. Okay, there is one more, but it's inspired by 1001 Nights, and it's called The Wrath in the Dawn. And it's kind of a retelling about this prince who he's cursed to take a new wife every certain amount of time, and he has to kill her to protect his family or protect himself from this curse. And it's about this woman who goes and she decides to try to sacrifice herself to break this because she loses a very close friend. And it's a romance story, but it's also a retelling of 1001 Nights, which is kind of from Arabian Nights as well, and it has like the Indian and Persian origin from like Islamic Golden Age. So it's very interesting. And I actually read a webtoon as well, like on Webtoon, that was also called The Wrath in the Dawn, that this artist had gotten permission from the author who wrote the book, which we do have in our collection, and I looked. And she completely illustrated the entire thing and retold it a little bit differently, but it was fantastic. I was hooked on this thing until it was finished. It was one of the first webtoons I ever read.
That's so cool. I guess I'll do my recommendation dump. I have when I was a kid, I don't know where you could even find these now, but when I was a kid, HBO had these the series called Happily Ever After, and they retold fairy tales, but from like in different cultures than you might have expected them to be in. Like the shoemaker, I don't know if you know that, where like the shoemaker has to make all these shoes for the emperor, and then the elves help him in the middle of the night, is like an ancient Mayan kind of setting. Or there's the Pied Piper, and they make that a man who plays jazz on his saxophone to lure all the mice out. And those are the ones that I really remember. And um I just really enjoyed adding like the new spin to all of it, as opposed to just like retelling it. It had like new cultures, and like they had a bunch of different popular voice actors and A-list actors on there. Another one that I want to recommend is I read this. It's called "Don't Let the Forest In" by C.G. Andrews, and it's a book about a boy who goes to a boarding school with his sister, and he likes to write fairy tales that are really dark, and his friend slash crush really likes to draw things from the fairy tale that he writes, and they during this school year start coming alive, and it's chaos ensues. That one was pretty good. And my last recommendation, I was talking about, I haven't read this yet, but I've heard a lot this was recommended to me, and I think it's really fascinating. It's called Disfigured by Amanda Leduc, or Leduc, however French works. And it's about fairy tales, disability, and making space. So I think it's obviously a more nonfiction kind of text, but I just think it's really interesting if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So also Zipes has really good essays on fairy tales. And
Yes.
that's it.
Okay. So Julia stole one of my favorites, which was the Lunar Chronicles. My favorite on that, shout out to Cress, and I forget her boyfriend's name, but he was like a Han Solo type of character. And if I remembered his name, I would say it. But since we have established I love Aladdin, so I'm just going to do a dump of mostly Aladdin retellings. One is The Forbidden Wish by Jessica Corey. In that retelling, it's for young adults, and the genie is a teenage genie named Zarha, and she's been trapped in the lamp for quite a while. So when she emerges from the lamp, she finds out that and then Thorn was the name of the character in the Lunar Chronicles. Thank you, Julia. So sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So sorry, anyway. I was not trying to interrupt.
In The Forbidden Wish, the genie, when she comes out of the bottle, she discovers that a lot has changed, that magic is forbidden, the genie are feared, and she has to disguise the fact that she's a genie until she can grant Aladdin's wishes. And she finds herself slowly falling in love with Aladdin, who is interested in Jasmine, who I think she's like more of a freedom fighter. I don't remember the exact detail what she did, and basically the genie discovers that the only way she can be free of the lamp is if she betrays Aladdin. So she has to decide like what's more important to her freedom or her feelings for Aladdin. So that was a good one. And another Aladdin retelling is the Stancy Trilogy by Chelsea Abdullah. That's an adult fantasy. It's supposed to be a trilogy. So far, the first 2 books are out. The first book is The Stardust Thief, and it follows Louis. I hope I pronounced her name right, but that's how I pronounced it in my head. She's a thief known as the Midnight Merchant who steals basically like genie artifacts, and she is captured by the Sultan and basically given an offer she can't refuse. She needs to steal an ancient gin lamp with the help of who she thinks is the Sultan's oldest son, but it's actually the Sultan's youngest son who's using a magical disguise after his brother kind of blackmailed him into taking his place. And there's along the way they're hunted by a djinn killer, and there's double crosses and intrigue and following the tropes where the younger son's the good son and the older son is not so much. There's all kinds of fighting over who's going to be ruling the land. I don't know what you call it, but anyway, that's my Aladdin retellings that I like. And then I also like Beauty and the Beast, and I've actually read some different historical fictions of Beauty and the Beast where it's not a fairy tale because there's no like fantastical elements, but you have basically the beauty character Sunshine with the grumpy Beast character. So this one is Romancing the Duke by Tessa Dare, and it's a Regency romance where our heroine is Izzy. She inherits a castle, and she goes to take possession of said castle, and she finds it's occupied by a grouchy, scarred war hero named Ransom. Ransom is like, nope, this is my castle. I'm not leaving. It was a misunderstanding that resulted in the castle being sold out from under me, so I'm not going anywhere. And it was a cute romance. Tessa Dare is good with like the humor. And so you have the sunshine grouchy trope for people who enjoy that. Another one I liked is another fantasy, Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. And this one is a retelling that I wasn't familiar with before I read the story of the Chinese moon goddess, Chang'e. I hope I'm not messing up the name too badly. Where her daughter, Xinyan, she doesn't realize that her mother has been hiding from the celestial emperor until she accidentally uses her magic and causes the emperor's men to come after her. So she has to go into hiding and go on a quest in order to free her mother from imprisonment. And there's a little bit of romance because she ends up interested in, I don't remember if it was the emperor's son or what, but there is like a prince type of a character, but the focus is on the quest where she's got to complete these tasks in order to free her mother. And a lot of fairy tales, it's kind of all about the female main character getting the prince, but in this case it's like, yeah, she gets the prince, but she's really into this to help her mother. So I guess anyone who liked Brave and how that was all about she had to free her mother, like that's kind of the vibe in that. And then my final recommendation that I haven't actually read yet, but it looks pretty cool, is we discussed Little Mermaid, and I love Little Mermaid. And I also like when they do like gender bent retellings where instead of like a mermaid, it's a merman. So there's one coming out, or actually it just came out, called A Magic Deep in Drowning by Hester Fox. And it's set in, it looks like the 1500s in the Netherlands. And like he's the mer person, and it looks like it's going to be pretty fun. So anyone who likes mermaid retellings and wants it a little bit different, check that out.
Okay. I have besides my ones that I said, that was completely unrelated. I did have a couple as well, if there's time to list them. Going off of one gender bent story, we do have one book in the system by Carrie Franzman. It's called Gender Swapped Fairy Tales. So anybody looking for just a big compilation of some shorter versions of stories that are all gender swapped, I found that one. It was very interesting. There's another one. I have a bunch of nonfictions that I found, which okay. But one of the ones I found too, it's a J-level nonfiction book called Once Upon a Time, Traditional Latin American Tales by Ruben Martinez. I like this one because it is in English and Spanish on the adjacent pages, so you can read it in both languages at the same time or in succession to one another. So if you're trying to learn a language with a younger kid, or if you're just trying to like learn it for yourself. Like I do find myself being able to learn Spanish a lot easier by reading the children's books while I'm putting them away. And that helps me more than like trying to hit Duolingo. Like I'm never going to pick that up, but if I'm actually reading an actual use for it, I found that interesting. Another one was, let's see, Spinning Straw into Gold, What Fairy Tales Reveal About the Transformations in a Woman's Life by Joan Gold. That one's just a cool nonfiction suggestion for anybody trying to do maybe a deeper dive. I also had Disfigured on here because that one just looked so amazing. The full title was Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. Also by Sarah Maitland, From the Forest, A Search for the Hidden Roots of Our Fairy Tale, or Fairy Tales. That one was very interesting as well. And then I had 2 graphic novels that were very interesting. One of them is a YA graphic novel by, I am not good at saying like Vietnamese names, but it's Trung Le. How do you say the name where it's like Nguyen?
Win.
Gwen. Okay. So by Trung Le Gwen, The Magic Fish. It's a graphic novel about a boy who reads fairy tales out loud with his mother so she can practice her English, but the stories hold a magic that takes things to a different level. And then I also liked Swan Lake, Quest for the Kingdoms by Rex Ogle. That one is cool because it's a J story. I read it. It's about these 2 characters, Odette and Dilly. Obviously, Odette being the princess that does turn into a swan by night via a curse, or swan by day via curse, and then turns back into a princess at night. And then Dilly, who is the princess of a neighboring kingdom. They're supposed to be enemies, but when they meet at the lake, that separates their castles. They become very quick best friends, and they both enjoy having the camaraderie of somebody who understands the pressure of being in a castle and being told you have to be a certain way, you're going to be taking over a kingdom, but wanting to have an adventure instead. And they both end up going on a quest together to discover who put the curse on Odette, how to break it, and stop the feud between their families. And it's just a big adventure that's super lighthearted and funny. And then the last one I'll say, I think, is The Singing Bones. It's another nonfiction. It's a YA nonfiction. It's The Singing Bones, inspired by Grimm's Fairy Tales by Sean Tan. That one's cool because it's just a compilation of photographs of sculptures that are inspired by the Grimm fairy tales. So that was just a cool look at it.
I have one more, and then I know we have to wrap up. Just because you somehow you guys talking reminded me of it. There's this it's a children's series, but it's really good. Like I read it to my guinea pigs. It's called Scary Stories for Young Foxes by Christian McKay Heidegger. And there's another one called the sequel is the same title but with the city as like a undertitle, whatever. It's so good. They're cautionary tales told to young foxes to help them survive in the world. And the first one, it has it portrays what's it called, rabies as like a zombie kind of thing. It shows who's that lady who drew all those pictures of the animals in clothes and made Peter Rabbit?
Oh, I know this. Beatrix Potter.
I love her.
Beatrix Potter is a villain in this because she used to stuff animals and kill them. So she's a villain in this, and it also shows like the foxes that are like going through these things, like getting to a sort of a coming of age story. And the second one is very similar, and it's really, really good. Like, it's for children, but my God, is he trying to terrify these kids? And also, I'm sorry, this is for the last one for real. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, not necessarily a fairy tale, but they're folk tales, and I think you children should find the original ones, not the ones with the new illustrations, because they toned them down in the new illustrations to not be as scary, but it builds character. So get the original ones by Alvin Schwartz and look at the scary pictures. They're all very fun.
Yeah. Oh my God, I loved those very much as well. And I did used to actually like scare the crap out of myself, like reading them. And then have some issues sleeping after. But I had a nightlight. It's fine. I loved reading those because I loved the thrill of reading them and I loved how creepy they were. And then that will unfortunately lead me into my last recommendation, which will be Holly Black's The Modern Fairy Tales. There's 3 short stories that connect. I'm only suggesting this because she does have a really great way of like writing fantasy and writing a fairy tale story that still has the dark elements that they always kind of started with. But also they take place around New Jersey, and Holly Black is from West Long Branch. So she's one of my favorite fantasy authors. I love her style. I wrote her a letter once and she wrote back. I think she's a really cool lady. She also wrote Spiderwick Chronicles. So she has a bunch of really cool stuff as well. But the Modern Fairy Tales were cool because they would say something in New York or New Jersey, and I'm like, wait a minute, I know that place.
Yeah, I think those ones, not to get confused with her newer ones, but I think that it was like Tithe and it was like one-word titles.
Tithe, Valiant, and Ironside, I think.
Yeah.
And it was the collection of the 3 was the Modern Fairy Tales, and then there was the Cruel Prince series, and then the new ones as well.
And then since we're all throwing out some more suggestions, I will throw out a personal favorite of mine when I was a kid. I don't know if we still have this book, but I know we have some by this author. The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Fairly Stupid Tales by John Skazika. I apologize for my no doubt bad pronunciation, but they just poke fun at all the fairy tales, and they have these good illustrations, and as a kid, like, they were just so hilarious, and I just loved to read them and look at the illustrations. So I would definitely recommend that one for anyone who wants a nice, light, funny read.
My last one is also by Alvin Schwartz, and it's called Goats. It's like one of those easy readers that like they have like the number 1 or 2 or so. I forget what number it is, like on the front. But the one story, I remember it always sticking with me. It was about like this little boy who got bullied by this girl. And then one day the girl died somehow, but she came back specifically to haunt him. So he somehow tricked her into going inside like a little bottle, and he threw it in the ocean. So like they were saying, if you see a bottle in the ocean, don't open it because this mean little 8-year-old bully could come out at you. And that like for some reason scared me so badly. But that's my last recommendation.
Oh my God.
It's definitely a fairy tale in that the consequences are very severe.
We do have the Stinky Cheese Man in the system, by the way. I've been trying to get into the catalog, but we have it. I remember him.
Yay. I had a really old tattered version, so that's why I wasn't sure if it because it came out in like 1992.
Oh.
It's been a minute. Thanks for listening. Be sure to visit our website, theoceancountylibrary.org/teams/fannation for a listing of all events happening this year. All titles mentioned on today's episode can be accessed for free with your library card. Until next time, have a fantastic day.